Today is all about the DM's Guide. Something I've come to realize over the years is that although most DMs own a DM's Guide and find it an essential purchase, many DMs I've talked to really only use it as a reference book to look up magical items and traps, and a lot of people don't actually give it a proper read-through. Personally, when I get my hands on a new DM's Guide, I read it through cover to cover, and if you're like me, then maybe this video won't be for you, because I'm going to be discussing some of the oft-overlooked and hidden gems found within the pages of the 5th edition DM's Guide. Now, countless times in all of the editions of D&D, I've heard complaints from friends, players, and fellow DMs about how D&D is lacking some essential rule or feature, just for me to point out, hey mate, it's right there in the DM's manual. So, let me point out some of my favorite things you might not know about, in no particular order. Let's start with some of the big stuff, combat options. Now, there are a lot of extra combat rules you can use, and it's important to note that nearly everything is optional in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's your toolkit to pick and choose from as you like, but the combat rules presented that I like the most are the action options. Things your players can attempt to do in combat that might not be covered in the player's handbook, but that no doubt turns up now and then in every campaign. The first of these is the option to climb onto creatures that are huge or larger, such as giants and dragons. We've seen this over and over in movies and video games, the hero climbing his way up the dragon's back to get in that finishing blow, and of course, your players will want to do the same at some point. Then we have the disarm option, again something that comes up quite often in most games and something media has taught us happens in every duel. In the player's handbook, disarming is presented as an option of the Battlemaster Fighter, and that's one of those hidden dangers in developing an RPG system. If you make something a class feature or special ability awarded for a feat or similar, then usually that means you cannot perform that action without having that feature. At the same time, you want your players not to be restricted too much by the rules. If they can think of it, they should be able to try to do it. And it's your job as a DM to make that happen. But if you let everybody do everything, then that kind of takes away from such classes such as the Battlemaster. So that might leave you trying to in mid-battle balance a disarm that is worse than the Battlemaster's but still has a reasonable effect. Or you can just go with the disarm out of the DM's Guide. There are also two options presented for moving through enemy spaces, which comes up pretty often in my games. The first being the overrun, where you try to brute force push your way past the foe. The other being the tumble, where you try to duck or weave past the foe. And there's an option for what happens when you try to shove someone sideways instead of directly away from you. Useful when your players try to throw an enemy off a cliff or off a riverboat, like in one of my recent games. There are also rules in this section that bring back a form of the marking your enemies, that makes your opportunity attacks better against targets you've attacked. It's the only action option I don't use myself in my games, as it's not really an action you can perform, it's just a modification to how the game plays. Personally, I kinda wish that all of these had been included as part of the base set of actions described in the player's handbook, but I'm guessing they were left out because they complicate the rules and combat a bit. But I highly suggest that you look them up. Knowing how they work might just make your next combat flow a little bit better than when you can just lean on the rules instead of having to make a ruling on the spot when your players step outside the normal combat options. Now, let's move away from combat and over to something I've touched upon in some of my other videos. Fear and horror. These were rules added into Ravenloft that I think are sort of a part of a foundation of that campaign setting. The DM's Guide has those rules, and they take the form of special wisdom and charisma saving throws. Now, these are important to me personally, because I run a lot of Ravenloft games, but I think that fear and horror can have a place in most people's D&D games. Ever thrown your players into a situation where their characters should be shaking in their boots, but your players are just laughing off the whole thing and charging in, spells blazing? Well, throw in some fear and horror checks, and you might just get the reaction you were hoping for. Remember, there is no need for fear checks if your players are already acting out their characters' fears. Call for them to drive in the point to your players that this is something that their characters should be afraid of. Whether they succeed or fail is really beside the point most of the time. Something that I feel is slightly related to fear and horror rules are some of the rules presented for alternative stats. Abstract concepts such as sanity and horror. Now, first off, sanity is an interesting ability score that really shouldn't be thrown into every single D&D game, but can be really interesting to add in to put a twist to your game. Very much inspired by Call of Cthulhu, sanity is a score of how mentally healthy and strong a character is. Exposure to terrifying and alien things will slowly warp the minds of the player characters and erode their sanity, eventually leaving them broken and twisted. In most games with a sanity system, a character has a finite shelf life. Sooner or later your characters will be reduced to a gibbering nervous wreck and won't be playable. But that is part of the horror. If you ever played the PC game Darkest Dungeon and thought of yourself, this is what my D&D campaign should be, or if you want to mix in some Lovecraftian mythos in your D&D sessions, then the sanity score rules are for you. Honor is something that also perhaps doesn't belong in every game, and although it won't leave your pieces as unplayable wrecks, it definitely has a massive effect on your campaigns. Honor is an alternative social stat that gives players options and consequences to social interactions. It really belongs in game settings where honor is of great importance, such as if you're running a game inspired by feudal Japan, or perhaps a strongly chivalric society, such as the Bretonnians of the Warhammer setting. It doesn't have to be a universal score either, but can be applied selectively. Perhaps only people of certain nations in your games have an honor score, or perhaps just certain races, such as dwarves or hobgoblins. The biggest reason to use honor in your games is to drive in the importance of honor within your setting. Giving something a rule makes it tangible. It makes something otherwise abstract and perhaps hard to understand real, and makes sure that there are consequences that the players can easily understand and relate to. If it fits in with what you want out of your game, give honor a try. You might just be surprised by how much of an effect it can have on how your players act and interact with the world. And speaking of putting rules on abstract things, how about reputation? Well, there are some rules you can use for that as well, with the Renown rules. The Renown rules can help you as a DM to keep track of the player's standing with different factions and groups in your setting. You can either keep a track of it secretly, or let the players keep track of their own renown. And as an added benefit, there are also rules for piety, basically how much renown you have earned with your god. If I run renown or piety, I usually let the players know what their renown are with their factions when it seems appropriate. I mean, sometimes you might not be sure what your standing with your boss is. But I tend to keep piety secret. Now you can of course just run this all abstractly. I'm sure you as a DM most of the time have a feeling what your factions think of your players or how impressed their god is with them. But codifying it into rules can help make it easier to keep a track of, and to make quick decisions. Instead of having to feel it out and think over if the players have earned certain rewards or favors, or a promotion, you can make it easy for yourself with the rules provided, and just glance down and instantly know based on their renown or piety score where they stand. And anything that makes the life easier for the DM is a plus in my book. And speaking of things, making things easier for yourself and reputation, there's also a section on followers and NPC companions, and more specifically a section on follower loyalty. Again, as a DM, you probably have an idea of how your player followers think of them, but when you need to make a split-second decision on whether the NPC is going to lay down their life for the players or turn and run, then it can help to have something written down. Another useful set of rules that is often overlooked are the chase rules. I've known plenty of DMs who just keep to the combat rules, so when a monster tries to flee combat, or a cut purse steals a coin purse, or even a player tries to make a break for it, the outcome is pretty much already decided on whether the pursuers catch up with whoever is fleeing. Now, in a lot of situations this can work, but it doesn't always lead to the most interesting stories. Instead, the next time the bad guy fails their morale test, by the way, that's another rule you might want to check out in the DM's guide, and the players chase after them to make sure there are no witnesses, then switch it over from a combat scene to a chase scene. Chasing after someone should almost never be a guaranteed success in my book, and it can lead to some really cool sequences. Think of how many movies and books there are out there where some of the most exciting action scenes are chases. Why deny yourself a setup for such an interesting story option? Instead, expand your games with chases. Now, I don't really have a transition into the next thing I want to point out, but I would also like to point out that the DM's Guide has a bunch of rules for the different planes of existence, and the effects that permeate them. Not nearly enough in my opinion, but there's still a bunch of rules here that can help you make the other planes feel more unique, such as the time-warping nature of the Feywild, the despair of a Shadowfell, and the corruption caused by the Abyss. I personally hate it when you reach this super exotic plane you've been hearing about for the entirety of the campaign, and it's basically just like anywhere else in the world, except maybe, if you're lucky, the sky is a slightly different tone. The other planes should operate according to their own unique sets of physics. Things should be weird and different out there, and the rules provided in the DM's Guide is a good start towards making those places a little bit more unique. There is also a fair bit of information about the planes in general, and all kinds of interesting lore you might have missed out on. Although, in my opinion, if you really want to flesh out the outer planes, pick up one of the source books dedicated just to them from the previous editions and convert over some of the rules from there. That would certainly help make them stand out. There are a ton of other things that you can find in the DM's Guide, from rules governing healing, wounds, social interaction, rules for owning and crewing ships to starting on higher levels, maintenance costs for buildings, and Asian versions of weapons. Way more than I could cover in a single video. Now, I don't use everything in every single campaign I run, but all of them are definitely worth a read. So if you haven't done so in a while, get out your DM's Guide and give it another look. I think you will find at least 1 or 2 rules you had no idea were even there. And if you enjoyed this look at some of the hidden gems of the DM's Guide, then why not leave a like? If you want to support the channel, then share this video with your friends or on social media. It really helps out a lot. You can also check out my DM's Guild products, or follow me on Tumblr or Twitter. I'll add links to all of that below. Until next time, Dungeon Delvers.